Welcome to the Common Cool podcast,
where we discuss the power of addiction,
the art of suffering,
and the joy of freedom.
Welcome to the Common Cool podcast. My name is Miguel.
And I'm Jeff.
Today we have a guest of a different kind than the guest we've had before. His name is Andrew Johns. He's had a pretty amazing career in tech. And we're going to cover a topic which is a little bit not talked enough about. It's a little subtle. It's hard to sometimes identify. And that topic is work addiction. It's really easy to turn your passion into an addiction where it's hurtful for you and sometimes people around you. So we'll unpack that topic, but not just describe what that is, but also some of the things that have helped Andrew overcome it and how kind of he went from a place where it got a little dark to now the place where he's at now. So without further ado, this is Andrew Johns. He's going to start with a little sort of recap of, his career, how he got started, and we'll go from there.
Jeff and Miguel, thank you for having me. In terms of my background, I spent about 17 years working in the world of startups. I had the sort of a mix of successes and failures, which is pretty commonplace in the startup world. But I guess you could say the Instagram highlight reel of my career would be that I spent time early on at both Facebook and Twitter when they were still relatively small products, being involved in the early days of figuring out how to grow the products globally. After Facebook and Twitter, I spent time at Quora doing the same thing. There's about 15 of us working at the company at the time. We only had about 10,000 users, so it was truly at the formative stages of the company. And then after that run on social media, actually in 2013, I stepped away from it for a variety of reasons, primarily that it just wasn't of interest to me anymore, and the products and the technologies are sort of evolving to something different than they used to be. And so I moved on from that and made my way into the fintech side, where I joined as one of the early employees at a company called Wealthfront. I rose up the ranks there. I was very passionate about the company and about its mission, and was excited to work on it because we were building a product that I wanted to use myself. And over the course of 5 years, I rose up to become president of the company. And I was next in line to become the CEO before a heart attack scare at the age of 35 unexpectedly interrupted that ascent. I didn't realize it at the time because I was stubborn and because I was still subconsciously controlled by a pattern of behaviors that I had put in place for probably 20 years that were still very much so directing how I behaved in the world without my awareness. Nonetheless, I stepped away from that company, convinced that I would slow things down a little bit after a fairly young heart attack scare. But then 8 months later, I found myself co-founding or being one of the founding partners of the consumer arm of an early stage venture capital firm called Unusual Ventures. And so I just jumped on another treadmill, despite the prior warning signs that I'd been receiving about me pushing myself too hard, working too hard, stressing myself out too much. And after a couple of years at the venture capital firm, that's when things just came to a head, and say mentally, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, where it was clear that I was heading down a unsustainable path with respect to my own well-being at the expense of, or I should say, I was trading off my own well-being for professional success and esteem. And I just needed to stop. And so I had a come to Jesus moment, which I'm happy to talk more about. And at the very end of 2020, I began to step away from my career and my work, realizing that I just needed to focus on myself and take care of my health. And so here I am, about almost 4 years removed from a career that I'd spent most of my life building towards. And that was successful across a variety of dimensions. But truthfully, on the inside, I was just a bunch of Band-Aids, suffering emotionally and spiritually. And that's now the central focus of my life is, having moved on from my career, it's really about trying to understand the true nature of reality and the complexity of the experience that we call human life. And that's what I'm focused on now.
So it sounds like in a spiritual awakening to me.
Absolutely, because just to jump into the details around how this break from my old way of being took place was, I was really suffering emotionally at the tail end of my career, which is what propelled me to talk to my partners and say, look, I have to step down. I'm done. I just can't do what I'm doing anymore. And I moved out of Silicon Valley. I left the life behind that I'd become so familiar with and I'd become defined by in terms of my identity. And I moved back home to Central California in a small blue-collar farming community close to where I grew up. And in retrospect, I realized what I did is by moving away from Silicon Valley, moving away from my friends, my network, everything I knew, moving away from my work, I created this large void. I created the space for a lot of old pain and suffering to sort of move to the surface. And I had taken up a morning practice of meditation in order to try and calm the anxiety and the depression that I was experiencing. And I began to get pretty deep into that meditation, such that after a month or two, I was up to about 45 or 50 minutes a day. And I would do that first thing in the morning. And then suddenly, every time I woke up and sat to meditate, I would just cry for no particular reason other than it was just this flood of emotions that I was beginning to let out. And then in the midst of one of those meditations, I'm sure that the Buddhist traditions probably and the Hindu traditions probably have a word for this. I don't know what the word is, but I had a sudden and spontaneous moment of deep self-awareness where it was as if the denial part of my ego stepped aside. And then I had this spontaneous recognition or realization that, oh, I'm dealing with addiction. I'm an addict. And I could see the patterns of addiction throughout many generations of my family. And with that instant awareness came just a flood of shame. And what followed for the next 3 to 4 days is kind of a blank, because it was such this intense awakening moment of self-realization and the shame and all the negative emotions that come from the recognition of addiction and the patterns of behavior that I'd stuffed down for so long. It was overwhelming. And that's why I say it's a hazy memory. But on the heels of that, on the 4th day, I remember sitting in my home office. I'd rented this apartment and I just had a basic little office set up. And as I was typing, because I was still at the tail end of wrapping up my career and stepping away from my position as a partner at the venture firm, when I looked out the window, which was directly in front of my laptop, and it was probably around 6 p.m., and the sun was somewhat moving towards the horizon, and it was behind a layer of clouds when I felt this overwhelming presence come over me. And it asked me to stand up, and I stood up. And as I looked at this bright light shining through the clouds in the sky, I just wept. And that presence asked me to drop to my knees, and I did. And I felt touched by what some would call God or the creator or the source. What I can say is it wasn't a natural or normal part of my typical waking consciousness. I was touched by something supernatural that happened exactly at the darkest moment that I had experienced since the death of my mom when I was 10. And that's what began a process of me saying, okay, it's time to repair and rebuild myself. And about a month later, I was in rehab.
Wow.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Andrew, for sharing that. Yeah. You say rehab. Did you go to rehab for work addiction?
Yeah. So I went to a 45-day residential treatment program. So, the full deal, it's a pretty big wake-up call when I drove 8 hours to the location, show up, and you check in, and they take your belt and your shoelaces, and it's the real deal experience. And I was there for a mix of addictions. I had a burgeoning substance addiction.
Okay.
I was definitely addicted to work and achievement. I had compulsions around dating apps and the whole hookup culture. And of course, being a tech employee, I was addicted to my devices. I mean, there really wasn't anything that I didn't have some compulsive behavior towards, because my nervous system was just completely fried. I had pushed down, 20, 25 years worth of old grief from childhood experiences. And those things were just sitting under the surface. And in retrospect, I realized that I would turn towards anything I could to just numb the pain.
Yeah. So when you say Band-Aids, those were all your Band-Aids.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's things that you were helping to reduce the pain, but bringing no pleasure. There was just
bringing momentary pleasure. You know how it works. It's call it the bad dopamine, not the good dopamine. Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, for sure. For sure. But it's confusing me when you say quit my career. Like what kind of falls under that? Like you quit that chaos. There's something about what kind of goes into that for you.
It was really it was quitting my career was actually symbolic of something much more significant, which was the beginning of the death of an identity. And an identity that had become deeply attached to, if not defined by, achievement. Because what I now realize in through psychotherapy and a bunch of the other healing modalities I've turned to along the way is that the root of my compulsion and my addiction towards work and achievement, it traced all the way back to some of the trauma I experienced as a child and the death of my mom when I was 10, and how I had interpreted those experiences in a way where I believed that I was responsible, that if I was just a better kid, if I was a perfect child, that maybe my mom would still be alive. And I had shouldered so much responsibility for the way many of those traumatic experiences unfolded, that coming out of that was an adaptation towards, well, if I'm not good enough as I am, then let me become perfect. Let me achieve and succeed at everything. Because when I was young and I was suffering, it felt good when I won the blue ribbons and got straight A's and was showered with love and attention from all of the adults in the world whenever I succeeded. And so I figured out subconsciously, without realizing what was happening, that in order to feel better, in order to feel lovable, I had to be succeeding no matter what I did. And fast forward 25 years later, and I'm the president of a very large financial technology company. And I can say pretty definitively that a large part of why I became so successful so early was driven by that subconscious belief that I wasn't good enough, and by the pattern of feeling lovable so long as I was succeeding. So back to your question of like, what did it mean to step away from my career? It was separating myself, or the beginning of separating myself from an identity that was defined by needing to achieve in order to feel good enough and to feel lovable. And the beginning of me trying to exist in the world in a different way, where I feel whole and capable of giving and receiving love in the absence of achievement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there, but where you realize, like, you know, because in 12 step, you know, Miguel and I are big 12 steppers. You know, we love, you know, the process, the community, the spirituality. I mean, it really lines up. You know, that idea, like, you're powerless to that. Like, you can't moderate. Like you said, I tried to quit for, you know, you had a heart attack scare. You tried to quit for 8 months and then you went straight back. It's like, you did it for 8 months and then you relapse.
Yes.
You went right back into it and shot straight up, you know, to the top of the ranks. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, eventually that, and this is where the 12 steps is really helpful for me as well, is the surrender aspect and recognizing the powerlessness. And I can say that that's still an ongoing process. You know, the stepping away from an identity that has such deep roots, especially roots in trauma, is no easy task. To die before you actually die, you know, to sort of die metaphorically, or the cognitive construct of identity, for that to break that down before the physical body dies is the hardest thing I've ever done. And surrender has just been the most essential tool, because at first I needed to surrender to the stranglehold my ego had on the idea that I just needed to keep working and doing more. I needed to surrender to the attachment to the wealth that came from it and the esteem that came from it. I needed to surrender in terms of letting go of old personal and professional relationships that just were no longer healthy. I needed to surrender and let go of where I lived and detach myself from an environment that was no longer conducive to my long-term well-being. Like, it's just been this surrender. And then when you think you've surrendered enough, just keep letting go. And I've come to understand that surrender doesn't mean do nothing. It means to as best as you can, just look at the situation as it is, see what is true about it, and accept that truth. And then once you accept the truth, that's the surrender part. And then you act based on the acceptance of that truth. And it's just been, 4 years of constantly doing that. And I'm still going through it. There's more surrender to come.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Miguel, did you want to say something? I heard that big dog in the background.
Let's see, but the dog allows me to make this question. First of all, thank you for your vulnerability. I think the part that you described, where you had this presence come to you, light in the darkest moment of your life, was quite beautiful. I think, not everybody gets to experience a spiritual awakening that way, right? In such a sort of bold way. For some of us, it's still more gradual, more subtle. So that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I think there's a few things that I like to unpack. I think what you were talking about regarding identities and surrender is so important. I think, it's all about ego deconstruction, right? Somehow our society builds us based on our identities. We grow up in environments where we are full of identities, right? Like we are Miguel the engineer, Miguel the tech leader, Miguel the dad, Miguel, fill in the blank. And the liberation from those identities, I think, makes us free. It brings freedom to our lives. And so that's one thing that I want to back a little bit more. And then when we talked about meditation, it seems to me like meditation was a huge tool for you. And I feel like those two are connected. I think meditation, along with the construction of ego and the unclinging of identities. So if you can unpack that a little bit more, like what was your experience like, meditation and unclinging to identities?
Yeah, meditation has been one of the tools. What I've come to understand is that, if you look at the arc of somebody's, their healing process, their transformation, their journey towards self-actualization, however you want to frame it, this process, or in Joseph Campbell's, the hero's journey, right? Is that everyone's process is different because there's never been an Andrew before, just like there's never been a Miguel and a Jeff, like the 80 or 100 billion Homo sapiens that ever existed. There's only been one of you. And so it's essential to understand that each person's journey is fundamentally unique. And that needs to be one of the first principles when it comes to trying to process your own journey or help somebody through theirs. And the other is that as the journey unfolded, I dropped into, I guess, what you could think of as these different depths of consciousness or these different layers of consciousness. For example, when I first began my journey, I was deeply unaware of myself. I was conditioned towards workaholism, and that's just kind of how I knew myself. There's very little self-knowledge and self-awareness. And so it made a lot of sense that when I began my process, call it like the highermost or the most shallow depth of consciousness, it began with psychoanalysis. Like, let me, at the level of intellectual analysis, understand how my prior conditions might explain my present circumstances, right? And so you go through family history and the experiences you might have had, and then you start to analytically connect the dots between prior experiences and present experience. And it's beneficial, it's helpful. With that awareness came some alleviation of the anxiety and depression and addictive patterns. Not fully, but enough to sort of, start moving in a positive direction. But eventually, after a few years of therapy, including EMDR, which I found to be a very effective trauma therapy modality, eventually, though, the psychotherapeutic method just was no longer beneficial. And I eventually realized that it was because, as I was mentioning, it's like your consciousness, your awareness begins to move into these different depths or stages. And I had moved into a deeper stage of self-awareness, but also a different consciousness frame in terms of my understanding of the world and how I viewed myself in it, which was precipitated sometimes by meditation, but also by the use of psychedelic therapies, which sort of like broke loose these calcified perspectives of myself and of the world that had been embedded in the physiology of my brain, and sort of shook me loose from a very rigid approach and view on life, to where then I viewed myself in a very, very different way, especially as I related to the rest of the world around me. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that meditation was really, really helpful at a specific depth of consciousness that I was at the time, as was psychoanalysis, as was EMDR, But eventually, as I moved into these deeper frames of self-knowledge and the letting go of identity, different tools and different methodologies work at these different depths. And in that way, it actually harmonizes everything from ancient spiritual mysticism and Eastern traditions all the way up to modern clinical neuroscience. Because like one of the things I notice is in the world of healing and personal transformation, there's this tendency for certain people to sort of champion one modality over all others. Or to say like, well, no, forget these modalities because we don't have any scientific proof for them yet. And let's only accept these modalities because we've run enough studies on them. And I think that's all faulty. It's this false dichotomy. It's this misunderstanding that as people move into these different depths of consciousness, from say somebody who is completely asleep all the way down to, a Thich Nhat Hanh, a Eckhart Tolle, a somebody who there's very little self there.
Very little. Little.
And from like the extreme sense of self to the absence of self, there are these different depths. And then different tools and methodologies work at these different depths. And so if I go into a psychotherapist in my first year of treatment or in my first month and they start talking to me about chakras, I'm going to be like, who is this wacko and what the fuck am I paying this person for? Right. And it's not necessarily that the chakras are nonsense. Yeah. It could just be that it's not relevant for that person at that depth of consciousness. And it's only once they move into a different depth where all of a sudden that philosophy and those modalities suddenly work and they make sense.
I agree. I strongly agree. I see that in my own journey as well. I think I started also with psychotherapy. Different therapists at different points in time had a hard time accepting the fact that I was an addict, but eventually I created a lot of chaos and I had no choice other than to accept that I was an addict. So then I started, 12 steps. So then the 12 steps it softened me in a way where I could accept spirituality again. Because I grew up Catholic, so spirituality wasn't foreign, but I was very anti, right? I was anti the word God. I was anti prayer. I would always say that praying was for the weak. That's what I would used to say. But in my 12-step journey, I became more and more open to spirituality, and then I started meditating. That's why I was asking about meditation, because I feel like for me, as I meditated more and more, and it became more frequent and then longer. Today I meditate 30 minutes a day, but I sometimes do 1 hour, 2-hour sits with some of my brothers that I sort of practice meditation with. And through that experience, little by little, I started feeling a different awareness of myself, right? Like there were these very, very short periods of time, very, very short, where I just felt part of the whole. I just felt like I am not Miguel. Like I am not this body. I am not this human. I am spirit having a human experience. And all of a sudden felt connected with everything. And then it went away like this, right? Just easy. But it was enough. But it was enough to feel like, oh, I get it. And then that led me to start reading Thich Nhat Hanh. Like I've read a few of his books. That man, oh my God, has changed my life and the way that I think. Eckhart Tolle, I listen to Eckhart Tolle every morning in the shower. That's the favorite thing. I have a little speaker in the shower just to listen to 30 minutes of Eckhart Tolle or whatever list, takes a shower. So now I did psychedelics for fun at some point in my life. I've never done it therapeutically, but by talking to some of the guests that we had in this podcast, like Dr. Evian, he's a neuroscientist, so he's explained to me, what happens. One of the many things that happens when you take psychedelics, like one of many is that the part of your brain that forms the ego just goes offline. Okay. So that part of the brain going offline, you can just recreate yourself in a sense, right? So that's why it's effective. So I totally resonate with this idea of the progression. And I think you said that everybody's unique. And so everybody's journey is sort of personalized in a way. So probably those sort of steps that you need to take are probably different for everybody, right? Maybe some people need to start with the spirituality and then they'll be open to psychotherapy, or the other way around. So that's very, very personalized. So I have a question for you, given all the stuff we talked about. So it seems like you're in a much better place in your life, and I'm very happy that that is the case. Some people find their path to get out of the darkness. Some people do not. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. My honest belief is that that's part of the natural order of things, where, to tie it back to what you said about we're spiritual beings having a human experience, not humans who rarely or occasionally have a spiritual experience, is that the collection of experiences that I've had, including those experiences that defy any rational explanation and that have connected me to the source of creation, to God. What they've suggested to me is that, and this is a perspective that is very consistent with the Hindu view of the world, which is that our essence is that of spirit. We are born into a human form by choice, preordained in a sense, where we know what we're signing up for in this human experience. And so you can think of ourselves as these sort of spiritual warriors who elect to have a human experience, which necessarily involves suffering, because it's through the experience of suffering that we develop wisdom and move closer towards the attainment of godliness. And that we are born again and again and again, the spirit that is us, born again and again and again in hundreds or thousands of different lifetimes in these human forms, because it is the training grounds for godliness. And that through this repeating cycle of death and birth, that somewhere along that lineage of lifetimes, we may eventually, quote, wake up through our suffering and then transform ourselves in human form to somebody who exudes that godly nature. Call it, call it Buddha presence, or call it Christ consciousness, or call it the Tao. Different words for that sort of like that everything and nothing that is the defining characteristic of the essence of the spirit that is in us. And that there's a certain percent of the population at any point in time that goes through that waking up, through that realization of their deeper self, and the realization that they are a spirit who is living a human experience with a particular objective in life. And that is to wake up and along the way help other people wake up to their true nature as well. And that this is the way in which humanity is reborn again and again and again. And so I really have no idea other than what I've experienced and what my intuition tells me. But I don't think I have no judgment with respect to why some people wake up and others don't, why some remain in a state of deep suffering and others liberate themselves from that. Other than that, it's unfolding as it was designed, and that maybe in some distant future, there'll be some large and spontaneous broader awakening, or maybe it'll just continue on like this forever, because this is part of the eternal process of training spirit towards the nature of godliness. And I just trust that it's by design. And from my experiences, I believe that for one reason or another, that in this particular lifetime, I elected to suffer in a specific type of way, but to also be given the chance to wake up from that suffering and become aware of my true self at the level of spirit, and that is happening for me in this life.
Right. That resonates quite a bit. My sister has been studying a lot of different types of spirituality. So she's almost like one of my spiritual mentors, if you will. And she studied Native American cultures, also native cultures from Mexico, and a lot of different cultures that have a lot of similarities, actually, more than some people realize at the spiritual level anyway. And what she has explained is literally what you said, that, our spirit decides, the challenge that it wants, in the human experience. And therefore, some people are destined to wake up spiritually and some people are destined to not. And we just have to accept that. And, I've had situations difficult in my life where close people to me, I have difficult interactions with people close to me and become very challenging. And then, many times my sister has said, well, you just have to accept it, because some people are not going to awake. They're not going to experience awakening. And you just have to accept it and just love them and pray for them. Versus criticizing them or judging them. Right?
Yeah. Maybe it's just part of their path. And in future lifetimes, this current experience they're having, like, it'll play out. And I think that's right, otherwise, what's the alternative? Is we sit there and we try and, in our mind, we wish everyone else was different. And I mean, talk about clinging, talk about a form of desire. And when you just wish, oh, I wish my dad was different in this way, or I wish my friends were different in this way, well, then you're just making an agreement with yourself to be unhappy in the present moment, because unless everyone else around you changes, then you're not going to be pleased. And that's just not how things work. Like we know this, having been through the recovery process, is that at the end of the day, the individual must choose for themselves to make a change. And everything else that follows after that is just implementation details, like that they've got to sort out and figure out along the bumpy path towards wellness. But it doesn't work by just saying, I need you to change because I'm unhappy and unwilling to accept what you are right now. Just suffering comes from that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of all my clients, I'm a psychotherapist. So if all my clients came to me like 100% willing to change, that would make my life really, really easy. People are at different places, and you help them to the next station, and hopefully they can go off. And I 100% believe, agree with you when it comes to therapy, that people, you don't want to take, clients hostage. You don't want to take them hostage. You have particular goals. Probably 70% of those goals are cognitive. Cognitive change, big behavioral changes, and then you get to the place where you approach new relationships. And approach relationships is another huge part, I think, of change. Like, I think relationships, are primary. Like, one of the primary, if not the primary, correlation to happiness, I think. And having that relationship with yourself, with others, and with something spiritual. So like the rehab therapy, or like a groups therapy, meditation, now yoga and stuff like that, you're kind of loosening up things a little bit, and you're taking that cognitive, and you feel safer inside. You feel like, okay, I'm ready, and you get to a point where it's like, I know there's more, I just need to find how to get there.
Yeah.
And it's And you can't, it's more of a feeling,
Yes.
And that's why, the idea of like being in recovery myself, the idea of psychedelics, the idea of like mind altering stuff is like, all the times I did LSD or mushrooms, there was a lot of tequila around.
Yeah, not the ideal setting.
Yeah, up this train. Yeah,
Nope.
let's do this. When you do psychedelics, or is you're kind of left to your own, aren't you? Or you're helped to kind of guide you in a. Yeah, I always think of the Socratic method. Like you have the answers, we just need to guide you to them.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, my experience with psychedelic has unfolded in a couple different stages. As I mentioned earlier, at some point I sort of felt like talk therapy and some of the trauma work I'd previously done was beneficial, but that it had reached its limit. And I still felt stuck in certain ways. I had this intuitive feeling of like, there's still major unresolved things. I'm stuck in these patterns and mindsets. And my intuition brought me to psychedelics. It was first introduced to me as a concept, and it sounded bizarre and strange and esoteric. And I sat on that for about 2 or 3 years until I felt that pull towards psychedelics. But when I did, what my experience with them was specifically when taking what is called the heroic dose. It's a large dose, say, of psilocybin, which would be typically 5 grams or more. I've had a few 6-gram journeys, and I've had an 8-gram journey, which, it's a big amount. Guided
Yes.
by experts, trained in Mazatec traditions from the peoples of northern Mexico. They've been doing this for a long time. And so I did them in the traditional ceremonial setting as defined by their culture. And what they did for me was that, neuroscientists will say, as you mentioned, Miguel, it basically turns off the prefrontal lobes, the default mode network, the sort of home of our ego defenses. This is the part of the brain that says like, nope, I'm going to deny this thing. I don't want to touch it. I don't want to feel it. I'm going to go on with this whole set of defensive mechanisms that I've put on throughout life, right? And the heroic dose is a large enough dose to where it effectively takes the prefrontal lobes and the default mode network offline. It just says, let's move you aside, okay? Because you're defending yourself as an organism wants to naturally. However, those defenses are now in the way of like these old things, these old traumas or complexes that are now becoming detrimental to your lived experience. Whereas you might have formed them earlier on as adaptations to help you survive, say from childhood abuse or whatever it might be. Those adaptations have now dominated your experience in life in a way that is now detrimental to your well-being. So now we need to move those defenses out of the way. Let's switch the DMN offline. And then what is underneath, let's allow that to come to the surface. And neuroscientists will also show you and say like, well, interestingly, it appears that these large doses of psychedelics will also connect parts of the brain that don't normally communicate with each other. It also illuminates a part of the brain that's typically associated with dreaming. And so that would be some of the sort of hallucinatory benefit or effects of it. And what my experience was is that it allowed me to go directly into old traumas. I relived some of them in a way that first uncorked a huge amount of grief I'd been holding. So much so that I remember at one point that, you do it with blindfold on, you ingest the mushrooms or whatever you're taking, and then 30, 45 minutes later, the effects kick in. But meanwhile, you put a blindfold on because it's meant to be a cognitive experience. And I went back to these memories. One of these was probably the most significant trauma from my childhood, and I relived it. And as I grieved, I remember at one point wiping my eyes because I was crying so much. And the tears were different. They were viscous. They were oily. I knew like these weren't normal, oh, I have something in my eyes tears. There was something that was coming out in the tears. Later on, I went and researched, and it turns out that there are, in fact, different types of tears. And that with grief-related tears, you can actually secrete stress hormone.
Wow.
Right? And so you can find large concentrations of different stress hormones through the secretion of tears. That stuff, I was literally not only psychologically processing those experiences and coming to peace with it, but I was also physically expelling and releasing the stuff that my body had been storing from those old traumas. And in my first couple of experiences with them were like that. It was working through the stuff that my ego defenses had pushed down and didn't want to work on or wanted to avoid. I was able to resolve those. I was able to grieve and release all these negative things I'd been holding that were underlying my compulsions and addictions, and move through those. And then eventually the psychedelics shifted in nature, where I was no longer retrieving old memories and working through these things underlying my addictions and my complexes. And then all of a sudden the experience profoundly changed to something more spiritual, where in some instances I had a direct encounter with an entity, which isn't uncommon in certain psychedelic states, but where I started to have these connections that began to reveal to me the spiritual nature of my living experience, my human experience, and actually built a direct connection to God. And that's when the atheist in me died. So in one example in particular, I was in the Amazon and I did ayahuasca. Yeah, I sit on the board of a nonprofit called Heroic Hearts Project, and we work with military veterans with PTSD. And the primary tools that we use are, we give veterans who have tried everything to alleviate their suffering, but with no success. We then give them access to these indigenous medicines, these psychedelic medicines that have been practiced for thousands of years. And that, the mental health industry is now really studying because there's something powerful there. And I've seen it firsthand. I've experienced it. I sat in ceremony with a handful of special forces. And in one of those experiences, it's quite painful because I was purging almost all night. And in one of those, it was probably about 5 a.m. in the morning. I'd been purging since 10 p.m. the night before. And I was just laying on the bathroom floor at that point next to the toilet because that had become my home. And I was in this repeating cycle, which is fairly common with ayahuasca, where you have these sudden profound insights. People call them downloads. It feels like a zip file is just downloaded into your brain and you suddenly know something. It's a clear message. It could be a message about what you need to do next. It could be an insight about a relationship that you have. It takes many different forms. But you sort of hallucinate. You have these insights when the insight hits, and it's this big epiphany, and then you purge. And after I'd purge, I'd then get in a cold shower for a moment and snap myself out of the intensity of that medicine, and then lay back down on the bathroom floor and do it all over again. And at one point, I was getting these downloads. There were very clear directives around the next step for me to take in my life. And at one point, I was laying on my back and my arms and my legs were splayed out. And then the words entered my mind that said, "You must suffer as Jesus did." And I felt myself being latched and crucified on the cross. And I remember saying out loud, "Okay, do your best. I surrender." I accepted it. And about 8 a.m., I managed to, the sun had come up. The medicine of ayahuasca had passed. I had purged. There was nothing left in me. I'd blown out some of the vessels in my eyes. Like, it was rough. not a gentle medicine necessarily. But as I lifted myself up off the bathroom floor and made my way downstairs to go meet up with the veterans who were having breakfast, I just wept with this profound sense of being reborn. And that's when I established a connection to God. And a series of events had unfolded over the following years that have strengthened that relationship. And so I share this because when we talk about psychedelics, the clinical research that's being run is making it clear that there's something very powerful there with respect to its ability to relieve trauma, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and substance addiction, especially with things like ibogaine. And so we're viewing it in this clinical psychotherapeutic frame of use these medicines and they alleviate different categories of psychological illness. And that is true, but what I'm saying is that these medicines are so much bigger than that I now don't believe that they are medicines that we use and that we then just heal ourselves. I think there's some truth there. Rather that these are medicines use us as a conduit.
Right.
That when we consume them, that what these indigenous people say is right. It's true.
Right.
That there is a spirit contained in these things, that when we bring them into our body with a certain intention, these things then perform soul surgery on us. And then in doing so, it uses us as a vessel to bring something important into the world. And that there's something profoundly beautiful and completely beyond measurement in a scientific framework.
You said something that I connected with at a personal level pretty deeply just now. You mentioned this moment where, felt that you needed to suffer like Jesus Christ did, right? And I did this kind of personal, but I'll say it because it came to my consciousness when you said that. So I'm going through some pretty rough times with my divorce, and the side effect of it is I haven't seen my daughters in a year. I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and it's been incredibly painful, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. And one day after I was done meditating, this image came to my awareness of when Jesus Christ was getting a vision of what was going to happen to him in the cross. And Jesus Christ said to God, take this away from me if it's possible, but if not, that's your will and I'll go through it. In that moment, that's what I felt about me going through this thing with my daughters. I came to a point where I said, God, it'd be great if I could see my daughters again soon. But if this is what I need to endure, then so be it. And that's the moment when I came to true acceptance of everything that's been happening. And it was just very, very powerful. So these instances, I mean, your message was different, but I connected both of them because it's just clearly a spiritual message that one gets to these experiences that are super powerful.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that, Miguel. And I could only imagine how difficult that is. And God, it's so much easier to say than do. But yeah, that surrender and the acceptance of what is in that moment. And then magically, when we do learn to accept and surrender, all of a sudden, this sort of process we're going through, it actually accelerates.
Right. Liberation. It's like literally liberation.
Yeah.
But I was very stubborn with the concept of first acceptance and then turning things over to a higher power. Both of those concepts just seemed so foreign to me because it felt like I was giving up. It felt like, oh man, you're asking me to be a loser. Like you're asking me to be complacent.
Yeah.
Like just surrender and then turn it over. What do you mean? I have to push something.
Which is totally contradictory to the rugged individualism defined by, more broadly by, I guess you could say, Western culture, right? And the world that we're brought up in of like, you have to always fight and never give up and take ownership and accountability. And it's not that needs to be thrown out entirely, but we need to have a more wise understanding of the consequences of that perspective on things, and that it doesn't allow for some of the peace that can enter your life through the acceptance of the situation as it is. And if I can share one of my favorite episodes from the show Chef's Table on Netflix. Season 1, there's an episode about a woman who's a Korean monk by the name of Jean Kwan. And she's been a monk for 50-something years. But the story for her is that when she was a little girl growing up in South Korea, she suddenly lost her mom when she was, I think, 14. And she was close with her mom. And so it just crushed her. And it wasn't too long after that, in the depths of that sorrow, she said to herself, like, I'm never going to have kids because I don't want to ever bring this suffering onto somebody else. And, that broke her father, who was like, how does a little girl say this? Like, don't say these things. But so one day she woke up and then she left everything behind and she hopped on a bus and she went out into the countryside at the base of the temple that was there, and went up the steps, and up at the top of the steps was a monk standing there as if he knew she were coming. And he said, "You've come here to live, haven't you?" She said, "This is a 14-year-old girl." She said, "Yes." And that's when she entered the temple and began her training. And then in interviewing her I think at the time she was probably 62, 63. She was reflecting on that path and reflecting on the death of her mother. And she said, with a very big smile on her face, just this amazing warmth, she said, I thank my mother for giving me the opportunity to become a monk. And that was the transmutation of suffering into purpose and into love. And I think that's what we're all just trying to do in our own way, is find whatever it is, a purpose to that suffering, because that's what anneals it. And then we transmute it into something beautiful that is the elixir of life that we're able to give back to the world. And I think that's what we're here for. That's part of this, the training of spirit towards godliness. And when we answer the call in the way that you gentlemen have, to give up our addictions, to work through our pains, at some point we come through that journey with our own, as Joseph Campbell called it, our own elixir. And that's what we bring back to the world, whether it's through podcasts, through sitting with our patients in a clinical setting, whatever form it may be. Just make sure it's authentic and it's your own. And this is how life works. So I just wanted to share that with you, Miguel.
No, absolutely. In full agreement. I mean, I think part of what ignited the energy to do this podcast, Jeff and I, is a lot of suffering. Suffering, like, in fact, one of the things that we say and that we do in our podcast is that we unpack the art of suffering. Because, like, if you quote unquote master the art of suffering, which is basically you understand your suffering and you transmute it, like you said, then you will suffer less.
Yeah.
Suffering is inevitable for growth, so you just have to accept it and use it as a learning growth tool instead.
Yeah, and accepting your story. Accepting that, like, that's your story. And I know you suffered there. I know you have remorse. I know you have guilt. But, there's something about that got you to where you're at right now.
Yeah.
And that's one of the, like, amazing things. I'm in awe of, like, the 12-step process and it being written in the mid-30s. The idea that, like, being an alcoholic addict, there's a program out there that spirituality is almost not it's almost a requirement. You know, they like push you in that direction. It's like almost like, okay, now you have a spiritual malady, you know, something about you is off spiritually, and you don't hear that. Like, you don't hear that with a psychotherapist. I wouldn't say like, well, you have a spiritual malady, we'll start treating that. Not for that. Like, spiritual malady covered me like curing their, you know, spiritual malady. Like, so the pretty profound. And we often say, like, I wish everyone could go through a 12-step.
Well, helpful. Would be so helpful.
It's like it's saying, like, and the spiritual awakening, the spiritual experience, you know, this idea of opening up this kind of new world, you know, with new perspective. And through that process, it's hard to not, you know, they always lean towards, like, it's hard to not realize that, you know, there is a higher power. You know, you don't say you have to have one because they're politically, like, they did a great job of balancing that program, you know?
Yeah. And the way they express, you know, in your own way.
Yeah.
You know, and like the version that I expressed just is the version that came out for me through my direct experiences. And I said, okay, that's it. It just feels right. And some other people may hold some similar version of that, and a lot of people don't. What really matters is like just your individual version of that, and allowing that come through. And it may take months, it may take years, it may take a decade or two. You never know. But eventually, when you have that experience, and you might define it as Christianity, or you might define it as walks in nature, whatever form it takes doesn't really matter, so long as it's authentic and it's the thing that helps you find the reason, finds a connection, and finds that the suffering comes with a gift. You know, it's in addiction recovery, this is the thing that I needed to really understand, and it worked hand in hand, or it competed hand in hand with my complex around perfectionism. When I entered into recovery, and then I'm several months into this thing, I like 200 days of like completely clean, celibate, the whole thing. But then I felt this weight, this psychological weight of perfection. I was like, if sobriety means perfection, like, fuck, I've been trying to be perfect my whole life. And so how do I rectify this relationship between sobriety equals perfection, and then here I am with this deep psychological complex around perfectionism and achievement and only being lovable if I'm perfect. And I'm trying to step away from that. And where I landed is I realized, like, well, addiction, or really to broaden it, like the encounter with our shadow, isn't a battle of David versus Goliath. It's not about slaying this dragon, and then once you've slayed it once, all of a sudden, oh, Andrew, the perfect person, is here now, and there's no dark sides of myself. It's not David versus Goliath. It's an eternal pendulum that swings from light to dark. It never stops. This is captured through yin and yang, right? This is captured through anima and animus. This is captured through these various symbols of balance that we see throughout all human cultures of time. It's that maybe this pendulum is really swinging, and that it's to soften into it, so that at least the pendulum tends to have a gentle swing to it. And so that's the relationship I ended up forming with addiction and addiction recovery myself, was to say, you know what? I'm going to drop this perfection thing. I'm not going to try and be perfectly sober on everything forever, because of the psychological burden of that as a perfectionist. No, it's just too much for me right now. I need to actually allow myself to be broken. Broken, quote. To be human, to be imperfect, to have my slips, and to have my relapses, and to take the training wheels off and say, this is life, and do my best to avoid the pendulum swinging really hard, from, okay, I'm super addicted again, and now I'm in this rat hole and I got to dig myself out. Instead, to have these little slips and just allow that pendulum to have a subtle movement to it and to soften into it. And then if, quote, perfection, pure sobriety comes out of that from that process, then great. And so I ended up establishing a very individual relationship with the 12 steps and with the higher power and with the concept of sobriety to begin with. And that's been part of my process.
Yeah, and that's interesting that the last part you said, if pure sobriety comes out of that one's so great, because that's kind of how it happened for me. I wasn't trying to be super strict at the beginning, and then things happened in a specific way, and now it's going to be almost 2 years in September. In September will be 2 years where we're completely sober, celibate, all the things, but I'm not trying to. It's just, it has manifested that way, and I just not even looking for anything outside of myself to feel good. I think for me, something that, too bad Thich Nhat Hanh doesn't live anymore because he's just such an amazing man, but his readings is really what's allowed me to, like he says, water the seed of happiness in me, and by watering that seed of happiness, like every day, that joy and happiness, and not water the other seeds, the toxic seeds. Like, I just feel so fulfilled that I don't have any desire to pick up a glass of wine even. I even realized, you know what? I don't really like wine at all. I've never liked it. I just drank it because I wanted to fit in, because it's the social thing to do. And I really, really like what you said about our dark sides. One of the things that I've learned, I'm still learning how to do this. I haven't learned fully, but I'm learning how to accept my dark side. My dark sides are part of me. They're not a different entity, and I just have to accept them and love them. That's what my sister tells me all the time. You have to love your dark. It's part of you.
Yeah.
It's not a different entity.
Because often that dark side was an adaptation that was formed based on prior life experiences for the purpose of survival. Right? And so how can I be angry at the addictive habituation in me that habituated itself towards high performance when that was the thing that got me out of deep grief as a child and then gave me a really good life until it went overboard? Like, how can I be mad at that thing that was so essential to my well-being at one point when I was just in a really dark place? And so how many people do you know that got sober because you shamed the hell out of them? I don't know anyone that got sober through profound shame. The shame just fuels it. It's like people get sober out of acceptance and love.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I kind of lost it. That motivation to change, that like ability to kind of put down, when you're doing that, when you're an adult and you're like still feeling like you need to survive, and everything around you is like, evidence of the opposite. Like, you got a nice, you're still working on this mode. Like, if I don't keep this going, like, I'm going to, die, especially when you feel extreme loss when you're young, or abandonment. Like, it's like, this is life or death. So like there's that emotional piece, like, you're safe now, everything's cool now, and that's hard to, like you said, you had the ability to put it, like, say, this is going to kill me. If I keep acting this way, I'm not surviving, I'm actually killing myself.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's a crazy paradox, like, to be able to let someone like realize that this is not helping your symptoms,
Yeah. And it is that fascinating paradox. And for me, it's representative of the paradox of life as a whole. It's this messy, confusing, beautiful, it's the tragic comedy, right? It's it is both of those things. And this is just the experience of it. This is the process of being in that sort of play.
Yeah, and it's so, I gotta say, it's gonna sound weird, but it's so fun to see it that way, because now, like, every day becomes an adventure. even where you're suffering, right? If you accept suffering as like a growth opportunity, then when shit hits the fan, you're not gonna suffer additionally from the suffering that you're already experiencing, right? So you're gonna go through the suffering that you have to go through. You're like, okay, let's go for it. Let's go with the challenge. Let's see what I'm supposed to be learning from this, and then every day becomes an adventure.
Yeah, and just soften into it as best as you can.
Yeah.
And give yourself some grace along the way. When you resist it at times, or when you get angry, or you fall back into habitual patterns, just kind of say, okay, all right, I know what this is. All right, let me do the next right thing, right?
Right. And accept imperfection, right? Kind of to what you were talking about earlier. Like, it's like I'm so controlling that I even try to control my meditations, right? So like when my meditation is not good, I wasn't good. I remember talking with my meditation teacher about this, and he's like, yeah, I'm like, what should I do when I just, I've gone days and days and days where I sit to meditate and I'm just thinking about my to-do list and I don't know what to do. He's like, what you got to do is you got to see it with gratitude. So when you sit down to meditate and your mind starts generating all these thoughts about what you have to do and all that, let them go, but don't be resentful towards your mind. Don't be resentful towards your brain generating those thoughts. Be, hey, brain, thank you so much for trying to protect me.
Yep.
And accept that. So I thought that was super useful.
And neuroscientists have asked this question. They run the studies. They said, like, what is the natural state of the mind? When you just leave it alone, what does it want to do? And what the brain imaging demonstrates is that what the brain wants to do is just spontaneously think of shit. And so, again, it's one of those paradoxes where it's like, sure, peace comes from a calm mind. But we're also created in the image of God, in the sense that we are creators ourselves. We can imagine things that aren't real, and then we bring them into our reality. The physical infrastructure of all of humanity at one point originated at a minimum as neurons firing in our mind. And then that was projected into the world. And so that spontaneous ability to think, to be creative, to imagine things that aren't there is also a function of the creation of the human experience. and so it's like, okay, sometimes I want to quiet that thing down. And at the same time, I understand that its default state is to be spontaneous. And that may be that serves a purpose as well.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah. Question: do you now that you were away from your career, you moved away from that chaos like 4 years ago?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you still keep in contact with some of your buddies that are still doing it?
Some, but most of them no. And that's been part of the surrender and the letting go as well, is because, as I mentioned, like when this spiritual awakening happened, it kicked off a process of the complete and ongoing deconstruction of my old sense of self, an ego death. And in the wake of that ego death, a different sense of self began to emerge. And that new sense of self, my really authentically who I am, has a very different view of the world now in every way. And the things that used to interest me in many cases don't interest me anymore. The people I used to feel connected with, I just don't feel connected with them anymore. The way in which I want to live has shifted. The types of romantic partners I can imagine myself being with has completely changed. And so I view identity as the foundation of the external elements of ourselves. So we have our identity, and then where we choose to live, and the things that we wear, and the hobbies that we have, and the friends that we have, and the career that we have are all things that are built on top of the layer of identity as foundation. And what happened to me was my foundation changed. My identity completely went through a major transformation that is still ongoing. And consequently, the external representations of myself have also changed. And I just have no interest in the tech work that I used to do. And in many cases, I just don't feel the same relation to people I used to relate with as well. And that's one of the hardest parts of a spiritual awakening, is the loneliness and isolation that a lot of people feel, especially through the first couple of years of it, because they are pulling away from those external connections that they used to have. And this new sense of self has not yet arrived or revealed itself. And so you're kind of in this in-between state that, you know, they often describe that's the liminal period, right? And in that period, you're metaphorically sort of in a raft pushing away from shore without another shore in sight, but that's what you need to do. And so, no, I'm largely disconnected from that world, other than I still exist in it, and participate in it in a much smaller way, but through a new lens, which is like conversations like this. I'm just expressing the experience I've had of suffering and a personal transformation, to put that out into the world, including within the tech community, just to relate or to connect with others who might be going through something similar.
Help a lot of people.
Yeah, so I used to, you know, I kind of have like one foot in it still, because these are the people that I know and understand. And through my lived experience and the changes I've gone through, this is part of the reason to my old suffering. You know, this is the elixir of life. This is the thing that I can bring back into the world, is to relate with the people from my former industry in a human way, not in a professional way. And it's been really wonderful, where there have been a couple hundred people, at least at this point, that I've connected with directly, who I've helped them in some small way on their own process of spiritual awakening, emotional healing, and personal transformation. This is the role that I now play in it. It's not about building companies anymore. It's about trying to set people free.
That's great. I love that. And unfortunately, we're going to run out of time here soon in 5 minutes, but I do want to post one last question, just connecting all this back to work addiction. So to some of the people that may listen to this who feel like, oh, well, maybe my hard work is starting to feel more like work addiction. 2 questions, perhaps. One is, how can people identify that their labor is becoming work addiction and it's not just like pure drive? What are the signs, and what should people do? Like if they're starting to feel like, okay, this is starting to feel unhealthy, what should they do?
I think one thing that they can do to sort of identify where they're at is to basically do a quick assessment, assess themselves on mind, body, spirit, community, and ecology. To imagine giving yourself a score from 1 to 5. 1 is not good, 5 is really good. To then say, how is my mind? What is the quality of my mind? Am I constantly agitated, stressed out, unable to focus, unable to be present? Or am I calm? Am I present, right? Assess the quality of your mind, score it 1 to 5. Body, do the same thing. Is my physical health improving or failing? 3, spirit. Do I feel the energy of being alive? You know, the way that you might when you pet a dog. And it just picks you up, right? Or when you see a big, beautiful open vista of mountains, you know, this feeling of aliveness. Is it increasing or decreasing? Am I participating or spending enough time doing the things that naturally give me that feeling of a life force? And then what is the quality of my relationships? So my nearby community, family, friends, loved ones, coworkers even. And then what's my relationship, my connection to my ecology, to my broader environment around me? Do I feel connected to it? And to assess and to look at it objectively. not self-critically, but to look at it and look for imbalance. And, if I were to do this in retrospect, I'd look at a lot of it and I'd say like, yeah, all of these are on a decline. My paycheck is getting bigger and people are like, way to go, Andy, look how successful you are. But the rest of these things, like my scorecard sucks. And so I'd say like doing these periodic check-ins with yourself, making that a pattern, especially with a partner, whether it's if somebody you're dating or it's somebody that you're married to, like doing that in partnership and having another person to bounce that off of is really powerful. Now, if somebody is, their intuition or their feelings are telling them like, look, I'm heading towards burnout. I feel the symptoms and signs of it already. I'm on an unsustainable path. What can I do? I say that there are two broad elements to this, and I'm actually at the tail end of creating a course on this for entrepreneurs and executives. So kind of great timing. It'll come out in September. I mean, it's all about emotional resilience and avoiding burnout. And I think there are two major categories. The first is you have to educate yourself on a modern understanding of nervous system management, especially as it relates to how the modern environment is constantly taxing a nervous system that was designed for short-term activation against physical threats that we know as fight or flight. But the modern environment is constantly activating that system through subtle psychological stressors. So we have an over-agitated nervous system that if you maintain a level of agitation over a long period of time, sometimes punctuated by these big moments of nervous system dysregulation, but it's actually the accumulation of an agitated nervous system through psychological stressors we're surrounded by, social media, traffic, all the shit that just makes us feel tense. That is overactivating a nervous system that was never designed or evolved to handle that sort of constant psychological stress. So you have to develop nervous system knowledge and learn about the daily interventions that you can use that explicitly are remote controls for nervous system regulation, whether that's breath work or meditation or thermogenesis through hot and cold exposure or walks in nature. There are all sorts of different methods that need to become part of your daily routine for nervous system regulation. So that's sort of step one. That's the like very practical felt experience of calmness versus being outside of an acceptable range of emotional tolerance. And the second part is developing subconscious awareness. There are an awful lot of high achievers across all industries where they may not realize that they have subconscious beliefs and complexes and patterns of behavior that continue to propel them towards burnout. And they're not aware of those subconscious patterns and why they exist. And until they become aware of those, they can't intervene and start to rewire those so that they can, frankly, just live in a more balanced way. And so I view it as two things: nervous system knowledge and having a daily toolkit of things that downregulates the nervous system. And then step number two is maybe you've got subconscious patterns that continue to propel you towards burnout and you're not intervening to rewire those things. So you got to shine a bit of light on that shadow and begin that work.
That's cool. Yeah. Will that be launched on the clues.life?
I'll be launching it on another platform. I won't mention it yet because we won't start promoting it until a couple weeks from now. But yeah, I'll post it on social media. I'll have that on LinkedIn. I'll also send that out to my clues.life newsletter. I got about 8,000 people in tech that are reading that now, which is pretty cool.
Hang on. We'll be looking out for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Clues.life. I mean, I want to go back in there. There's a ton of articles that you posted I want to read.
Yeah.
Really.
And if I can for a moment, what the vision I have for it, it kind of spontaneously popped out of in the middle of this experience I'm going through, as I've surrendered and just allowed God to kind of work through me, is, as I mentioned earlier, it's like everyone's got their own path. And so the best you can do is search for the clues, like a lion tracker might, just looking for the next paw print to see where this destination is taking you. So you search for the clues to understanding yourself and to sort of living the life that you imagine for yourself. And so I built this like Spotify type interface where instead of exploring different genres of music or different albums, you might be able to explore different fields of knowledge and wisdom with respect to the art of living. And so I'm just in the beginning stages of like building out this large library that I think of almost as like a modern Library of Alexandria, ranging from ancient spiritual traditions up to modern physics, because all of these, in my view, actually explain something about this experience that we call reality. And then to just create this environment where people can search through it, either using an AI interface or something else, to explore all of this life wisdom to discover the clues that helps them understand themselves and move forward.
That's awesome. I love it. So if people are interested, they can just go to the website and subscribe to the newsletter, right?
Yep.
And then, awesome. We'll put a link to it in the notes of the podcast.
Appreciate it.
Andrew, thank you so much for coming in. This was an awesome session. I really enjoyed it. I hope that people will enjoy it as much as we did. And till next time.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you, Andrew. That was really great.